philosophical significance of narcissism and codependency. And I think to start, I just want to welcome all of our experiences in the room. I know that I came to this topic because of very deeply personal histories and relationship dynamics and self-awareness dives that I've been a part of, and it can be a very painful and very tender thing to look at. And so I just want to invite that, there are probably different reasons why each of us was touched and inspired to come here, and that's all welcome. I'm going to do my lecture, and then I'm going to make sure to leave some time for discussion and question and answer. And also feel free to jump in at any point if something sparks you, or you feel like sharing or questions about anything. A little bit about me. My name is Mariah Karina. My original training was as a cyborg anthropologist, which sounds really fancy, but basically it's about looking at the relationships between humans, nature, and technology, and understanding how that leads to these fundamental categories of how we perceive things, and this very sort of on-the-grounds reality of how the world comes to be how it is at any given moment in space and time. I recently got my master's degree and just finished my postgraduate education in something called process-oriented psychology, which comes out of Jungian psychology and is very interested also in practical applications about how you really use self-awareness as a tool for shifting the way that human beings can navigate through life. And I'm also a love addict. I've been a love addict. I've also been in Al-Anon, which is for friends and family members of people who have struggled with addiction. And so all this stuff is really personal to me, and it's added like a depth of personal empirical richness that I've brought to these topics, having to really sort of look at some of the patterns that I've been a part of and pick them apart and understand them. So what we're going to do this evening, this beautiful summer evening, is I'm going to go through my definitions of narcissism and codependency. Again, feel free to contribute. I feel like we all have different perspectives on the prism of what these things are. And then I want to situate the two of them in contemporary society, because you're right, they're being used extremely frequently. They've become very, very popular and in colloquial use, and kind of trying to understand where that popularity might come from and what that proliferation of use might be pointing to in terms of where our consciousness is these days within the space and time of society that we occupy, and where those words are being used. And then I want to actually go to the myth itself, the myth of Narcissus and Echo, which a lot of people have correlated to codependency, or sometimes people use empath instead of codependent, to sort of glean from the myth, to harvest there and see if there's additional insights that the ways that the ancients conceived of some of these psychodynamics can have value for us looking at these things now, and then explore the relevance of this to contemporary philosophy. So that's kind of a roadmap of what we're going to do this evening. I'm excited. Okay, I'm going to start with this quote from the Upanishads, from the 4th Brahmana. And it says, "Wherever there is an other, fear arises." And I'll get back to this, but I wanted to start with it. Hi, welcome. Because ultimately there's something inherently relational or inherently social about the ways in which we conceive of narcissism and codependency. That they're almost describing clusters of behaviors and ways of conceiving of relationship themselves. And relationship implies this too. So to hold this in your mind, wherever there is an other, fear arises, and we'll get back to it. And this is actually in the origin story, like the Upanishads version of Genesis, where originally there was one, and then the one became the two, and then the two gave proliferation to the 10,000 things, right? Right here, when one became two, wherever there is an other, fear arises. So I want to start with narcissism, which I think would please people who run narcissistic process in the room to be able to go first. And I've done a lot of literature reading about narcissism. I've sort of coalesced what it is that we call narcissism. I mean, in a certain way, using any of these very pathological terms is almost like an ink blot, right? It's like a Rorschach test. Like, everyone's version of narcissism is slightly different and informed by their personal experiences, by people who they have in mind, who they might be thinking of, like the president, whatever. But I've sort of done a lot of research and kind of brought it down to these 7 things. So the first is lack of empathy, right? Like, and you hear that a lot in the literature, that there's this inability to have genuine empathy, genuine like care and compassion and understanding for someone else's emotional experience. There's this magical thinking and grandiosity, which often gets interpreted very much in terms of themselves, in terms of their own self-belief, their own narrative of who they are in the world, what they can achieve, has this magical thinking and grandiosity. The third is arrogance, which is that kind of self-inflated idea. I can do it best, I can do anything. And then we get into these other things of like envy and jealousy, which I think doesn't necessarily go along with our caricature of narcissism, who's might be, at least for me, someone who's just like, I'm number one all the time and willing to win at any cost. But it's almost like if you go a level back, like that might be what's being expressed outwardly, but underlying there's this deep sort of envy, jealousy, comparison, insecurity at play. There's also a sense of entitlement, and that entitlement in terms of feeling like you deserve things. And I feel like this is potentially exacerbated due to assumed social privilege. And right here, I want to start breaking it down because psychological diagnoses, and I prefer to think of it in terms of running process instead of being a thing that is static, that is your identity. Like if you have someone who's running narcissistic process, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a very complex set of social systems that we live in. So a lot of time you see narcissism, narcissistic entitlement showing up in collaboration with other social institutions, right? So it's like, I deserve to be the best because I'm a man, and men are better than women, for example. Like I deserve what I'm getting because I'm from the United States and it should be mine. So you can see that different social institutions and awarenesses become conflated, almost like sucked in and expressed as part of this narcissistic entitlement. This is a thing that comes up, and we'll talk later about a lot of the ways in which they're thinking about narcissism and codependency these days are part of a system that works together. And this is where you see exploitation and manipulation of others, which we'll get into, and also bad boundaries, which might not be the way to say that, but sort of a lack of respect for boundaries that another person or that something might be trying to set up. And there's this guy named Craig Malkin, who wrote this book called Rethinking Narcissism, that I absolutely love, and he had a different perspective on it, that actually narcissism comes from this innate human drive to be special, and that actually this is something that exists in all of us, and when you see it become something that's more overt and negative narcissism to the point where it might receive a diagnosis from someone who's trained to do so, it's more of an exaggeration of a latent capacity that exists within everyone. And I think this is true in general for diagnoses, right? That there's almost like certain tendencies that run through human beings that once they get expressed to a certain degree, become problematic. And what he did is he created the spectrum of narcissism, and he actually has an exam that you can do that's interesting, where he gives you a scale from 1 to 10. And he said 10 is like this overt, unhealthy narcissism, kind of what we all know, like the worst of a lot of these qualities. And under there he puts this idea of like the desire to win, like the desire to win in the short term at any cost. You know, that's the only thing the narcissistic process person can see. In here are a few other things that have been identified as going along with narcissistic process that I think are really important to understand and be able to recognize when I see them. The first is gaslighting. And that's this idea where essentially what the narcissist process person would do is they have different strategies in order to decenter and usurp the other person's sense of their own reality. So a few examples of how this would play out in relationships would be that someone, the narcissistic process person, would like turn on all the lights in the house and then go to the person who they're with and say, why did you turn on all the lights? It's confusing the person's sense of their own reality. What are you talking about? I didn't turn on the lights, then why are all the lights on? But it happens even in more subtle ways, right? And it happens in more invisible realms. Like something that I feel is very common in gaslighting is as simple as someone will be upset with them and they'll say you have no right to feel that way, right? Completely denying the other person's reality, taking away their own ability to experience themselves and have room for their own phenomenological existence in the narrative of the relational space. Another thing that goes along with that is this concept of love bombing. Have you guys heard about love bombing? Okay, it depends how it's done. I would say considering it's on the 10 over there, it's had a lot of negative consequences and collateral damage. But love bombing is fascinating. Basically, there's like certain patterns were collected about narcissistic behavior in relationships. And this pattern was noticed where in the beginning of the relationship, the narcissist process person will give an extraordinary amount of love and affection and proclamation of their adoration for the other person. Like above and like, you're the most amazing person I've ever met. Like, I wish that I'd never been married before so you could be the first person I've married. Like, I've never felt this way in my entire life. Like, you're everything I've been waiting for forever. All of these things. And it's love bombing because it has that same effect of destabilizing the person from their own reality with such intense emotion, because it's like, wow, I guess if you're feeling that way, then that must be what's happening. Like, this must be the most big magical love that's ever existed. You're feeling that way. And of course, it's coming along with all this flattery, it's coming along with all of this pumping you up, right? So you tend to go along with it. But in the meantime, you're sort of getting pulled further and further away from a grounded sense of what you are feeling, right? And into the other person's story about who you are to them and about what your love means within the narrative that they're constructing. And so it's also problematic because it goes along with a lot of what I think are kind of like unhealthy Hollywood versions of love that we've got that go with this sort of like magical sweep you off your feet period of falling in love where everything is turned upside down, you know, and it's harnessing the sort of I would say almost like platonic version of love that we have in our minds and exploiting it in order to basically create a power differential where the person with the narcissistic process has more power in terms of defining what's happening between you and how you're really feeling. I think the other parts of narcissism, does that make sense? The love bombing? Yeah, totally right. Also go along with this fear of vulnerability and narcissistic rage. So there's been a lot of studies done on narcissistic parenting, right? And there's this idea, narcissistic parenting, which is kind of this idea where like the child, does this work? Yay. Okay, so the parent sees the child as an extension of themselves, right? And will want the child to be great because they want to be able to see themselves as great. So this might go along with wanting the child to succeed a whole lot, to wanting them to be popular and be loved and attractive and express whatever traits that they have deemed valuable. And this can feel like a really beautiful relationship until the child begins to individuate, until they begin to maybe go into activities or expressions that don't go along with the parent, and when they start trying to put up boundaries with the parent and define themselves in their own terms, as opposed to what they mean in terms of what they mean to the parent themselves, right? And a lot of times this is met with a kind of like narcissistic rage. And this can look either like at what we might consider typical of rage, but it can also look like accusations to the other person, right? About how much the child is hurting the parent. It's like, how could you do this to me? You're killing me inside. All of those types of things are a type of sort of inverted narcissistic rage that's intended to get the other person back on their side and do whatever they want them to do. Anyway, so he said all of these things are sort of just fleshing out this idea of what narcissism means, and all of these he would put in unhealthy overt narcissism 10. Yeah? But the thing about this innate human drive to be special is that in a certain sense we all need a little bit of that, right? At least if you're going to be in late capitalistic, super individuated 21st century US context, right? You need to have what he calls like more of a 5 on a scale, which is a healthy amount of narcissism. which is just believing in yourself, being able to take risks, having a certain level of confidence, being able to be creative, being able to love another person. You kind of need to feel like you're worthy of being loved, and that the other person is special, and that it is somehow special that you found each other, right? In order to be able to like make a decision. Like there's so many things in order to be able to determine what your life is gonna be that require some level of believing in yourself and having an image of who you are and being able to go for it. So he actually says we need some of this sort of like feeling of specialness and also the drive to be more special, which we'll get more into later. And then interestingly, on this other side is like this 1-2 sort of zone, which he calls covert narcissism, which is tricky, right? Because in covert narcissism, the person believes that they are special, and yet they believe they are so specially horrible. Like so horrible, like that they like can't even have a party. Like so horrible that no one can look at them. Like so horrible, like any attention feels like dying. Like so horrible, like only they could possibly be that worthless kind of thing. So it's this world where the person is still like maintaining this sense of specialness, this sense of like exclusiveness about their specialness, and yet it's entirely negatively oriented. And what's really tricky is you'll have people who swing back and forth between covert narcissism and overt narcissism, back and forth. This is its own narcissistic pattern of like, God, I'm horrible, I shouldn't even exist, I am what is gonna save the world, oh my God, how could I think that, I'm horrible, like, no, it really is true, right? And it's kind of like this self-perpetuating cycle that can show up. So that's narcissism, in terms of kind of like fleshing out what it is. Yes?
One thing I remember hearing about narcissism refers to the refusal to accept responsibility for any sort of criticism or any result that they themselves don't like. It's always somebody else who's did it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Blame 100%. And I think that's also like having to admit that you lost or having to lose face. And we'll get into this more when we kind of take a deeper look. We're just sort of looking at the expressions now. But it is absolutely from that deep insecurity, right? And you could say narcissism is a self-orientation, but it's a self that's entirely defined by the way it's being received by the audience, right? It's like it's all about me, and yet the sense of me is entirely determined by how I'm ranking in terms of others, how much social power I feel I'm holding over people. So even if it's a self-orientation, it inherently implies the relational comparison, competition, and field in which this self-orientation takes place. Yeah. In which case, if that desire is to win, if that desire is to be seen as the most special, you can see how any sort of blame, any sort of negative feedback is terrifying, and must be squashed out at all costs. And then I think a lot of these are sort of like the strategies of attempting to squash out that dissonance, attempting to like use the power of the object self in order to maintain the social field according to where it feels safe and how it wants it to be. Now, so we're going to put that over there. We're going to come back to try and find this sort of deeper principle between the two. But looking at codependency is a term that came out of Alcoholics Anonymous in like the 70s and 80s. And it was trying to attempt to describe, right, that there were certain psychobehavioral patterns that came up again and again in the partners and loved ones of people who were going to Alcoholics Anonymous and later Narcotics Anonymous. And people trying to look, right, what is that? And what they came up with at that time was if there's a partnership, right, or a family system or whatever it is, there's one person who's addicted to a substance. And then there's the other person that's addicted to that person or to the relationship. Like they're actually codependent, they're co-addicted. And that the person being addicted to the substance and their partner being addicted to them is what enables these cycles to perpetuate and what sort of keeps people in coming back again and again for what they call cycles of abuse. So traditional cycles of abuse, they call it like there's this hearts and flowers period where everything's amazing, things start getting bad, then things start getting really bad, there's some big climax, maybe something aggressive or violent or verbally abusive happens, the other person goes away, and then the more abusive person in this model tries to win them back again with hearts and flowers, and they come together, and the ecstasy of coming back together is enough to sort of keep people around for the whole cycle to go again and again and again. And they're saying that in this situation, one person's addicted to the substance, which is what's sort of making that abusive or unhealthy behavior happen, and the other person is addicted to them and the cycle. And it's interesting to think about it in terms of codependent. And I'll get into that later. So this has also been looked at extensively. If you do feel like there's a lot of great resources out there in terms of healing from codependency. I personally went to Al-Anon, which is meetings for people like that, which I found very helpful. If nothing else, to hear the stories, right? The structure of the meetings is people will go and they'll just tell the story of what's happening to them or what has happened to them. And it'll go like story after story after story after story, and they all share a very similar structure. And what it did for me is it took away my ability to believe that my circumstances were unique, right? That it's like, oh, but this person I was in love with was just so amazing, or oh, their behavior's okay because of this like whole web of circumstances. No, I was engaged in a pattern like everyone else in the room was engaged in a similar pattern. And it made me want to look more deeply at myself, which I think is also healing in terms of being codependent, because you could say that codependency in a certain way is this other orientation. So whereas narcissism is a self-orientation that's reliant on others, codependency is an other orientation that's reliant on yourself. So it's constantly checking in, how are the other people feeling? Do they still love me? Am I showing them enough love, right? If not, what can I do to ensure more love? And this sort of other orientation and believing that the level of love that you're receiving from others directly influences who you are and how worthy you are. And so these 7 things that I sort of put together about this is 1, there's a denial and disconnection from the codependent process person's own internal state, right? It's very common just to hear that codependent people, they don't even know how they're feeling. They don't even know. All they're aware of is how the other person is responding, and then how they're trying to like mold that into a way that would be more beneficial. I'm a therapist in private practice, and one of the main things that I look for when someone comes in talking about their relationship is within the first 5 minutes of someone talking about a relationship difficulty they'll have, what proportion of that are they talking about their own emotional experience and how they feel versus how much they're describing the other person's behavior and how they believe the other person feels about them, or things that they did that made the other person mad, right? You can tell very clearly if someone's more other-oriented or more self-oriented. And it goes along with this disconnection from their own emotional state, which goes hand in hand with the second thing, which is this reliance on others for a sense of approval and identity, right? So needing to be loving, like needing to be there for others, becomes an identity of itself. And who the person is outside of that relationship becomes further and further away. Codependency also goes along with a lot of perfectionism and inner critic tendencies. So you get these people who are very, very hard on themselves and really want to do right and really want to do good. And I actually think that this goes in hand, like huge low self-esteem, all this fear of being alone, and that their sense of self-worth comes from being the good one. I actually think that that's one of the major ways that codependence process goes, is like this constant desire to be the good one. And what's amazing is you're with someone who's the bad one, so to all your friends you look good by comparison, but then they're also giving you all of these opportunities to be the good one to them, Right. So you get these people who have this extreme attempt where they're trying to be perfect, they're trying to be good, and they're actually looking for an external source that will tell them if they're good or not. So there can be something about the sort of games and structures that the relationship sets up that allow them to engage in that game of proving their goodness. Yeah. Again, looking to that relationship for their validation. And there's this feeling that events and situations are happening to them, right? So it's again that feeling of like feeling generally powerless and disconnected from one's own agency. And, looking so deeply at codependency, in process-oriented psychology, we always say there's something good about it, right? There's something that the person is getting. Even if you're addicted to a substance, right? Or you're addicted to a person or a situation, there's an essence of it that has enough of something that catches you, right? And so believing without judgment for a second, without right and wrong, that there is something that this person is getting from engaging in these dynamics and experiences that goes along with their idea of who they think they are in a way that makes choosing these behavioral patterns palatable for their identity construct in a way that other things might not be. And I think this is important because especially these days, there's sort of this narrative that narcissists are the abusers and that codependents are the victims, or that the codependent themselves might be codependent because they're attempting to rescue the narcissist. And this goes along with something we know very well, which is Cartman's triangle. There's this psychological researcher who identified that there's this triangle that's very, very strong in the psyche, where there's abuser, victim, rescuer, right? And what's very dangerous about this cycle is it only takes one person being in that role to constellate the others, right? It only takes one person feeling like a victim to suddenly triangulate, indicate that there is an abuser, and most likely there's going to be someone trying to rescue them from it. Or it only takes one person deciding that they're going to rescue it, and already they've determined that someone's the abuser and someone's the victim. And what to me is dangerous about using this model is that these roles tend to just ping around and not resolve, right? Ping, 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 ping. So let's say you're with someone and you feel like they're the abuser and you are the victim, and yet then they'll accuse you of being the abuser and they're the victim, and then your friend comes in and says they're abusing you, and you say, no, you're not, you're abusing me, and then the partner's the victim. It just goes around and around and around. It's a little bit maddening. So for the way that I like to think about it, goes back a little bit to that spectrum, right? That these are tendencies and processes that run through human beings, and that there is a point where it becomes damaging. It becomes damaging to the individual, it becomes damaging on a larger level in society or in their social group. And that needs to be dealt with in certain ways. It might be similar to addiction, right? Where it's there's a little bit of gray area where you're engaging in certain things and maybe using certain things, and then there's a different point where it's addiction and you need to deal with it a certain way, right? So that's a different thing. But just in terms of a lot of the ways that our dynamics interlace with each other, I like to think about it as that there's a little bit of that essence, kind of, that we can find, right? There's a little bit of that feeling special that we can find. There's a little bit of that codependence other orientation, right? That's also has some type of quality in it that we can be self-aware of and watch. That points back to self-awareness instead of to this triangle. Because I think there might be some points in a person's life when they might be recovering from certain levels of narcissistic abuse, in which understanding themselves as a victim and being able to put language to what happened to them is really critically important for their healing journey. Yeah.
It just seems to me like with a narcissist, the narcissist requires an audience. Like if you took a narcissist, they
They both need an audience, right? They both need each other.
I think that my sense is with the narcissist, they're always having attention from one person where we do it. You know, they want a broader audience than just one person. They want to step outside and gather all they can.
I think it depends on the person. Like a lot of times, if what you really want is to feel like loved and powerful, just one person is excellent, right? Because you can really achieve your goal there. Whereas like two people might be too many variables. But I think you're right, that need for the audience is fundamental. And the same with the codependent, the need for the validation, the other person to serve, right? The other person's emotions that they can kind of roll on is also fundamental. Oh, and just about this is like, I think, yes, at some point in your healing journey, picking up what happened to you and being able to be honest with it is very healing. But especially because of the denial and disconnection from your own internal state, what I've seen be more healing in the long run is actually cultivating a depth level of self-awareness in which you understand how you also participated in the dynamics, because it's more empowering, right? You could at any point meet another person who acts that way. And so getting to that place where you understand, this is what I did, also gives you a grounds to be like, and this is what I can do differently. And it gets you out of this thing, right? But in terms of what's good about it, I just want to go into how this might key into some things. One thing, okay, is like in terms of codependency, I feel like we're gonna have this way back. All right. I think one thing that you hear again and again with codependence, I see people who identify that way, is that one thing that they loved about those relationships with narcissistic people, and also codependency doesn't always imply a narcissistic process person on the other side, yeah? But it's more and more common. So I think part of it is like this feeling that they were reflected honestly, yeah? And we'll go into this more in a second, but if you look at the roots of where narcissism and codependency come from, they actually come from very similar early childhood development scenes, where the social self was celebrated, but the being wasn't truly met, right? So with a lot of narcissistic households, you hear about someone who it's like, every time they won like a sports game, it was celebrated, right? But if they were at home and playing, the parents or caretakers wouldn't play with them, kind of thing. And so it creates this emphasis on the social self, and this idea that where love can be gained is in terms of the presentation that you're able to have in the world. So there's this fundamental like not being met and seen and touched and really allowed to be, and only having how you showed up in the social sphere addressed. There's something very similar in terms of codependency, where a lot of times you'll grow up in a household that is completely oriented towards the other. And so you get entrained from a very young age that your existence is meant to serve other people, that you exist in order to make other people feel good. And so again, it's that deep self that isn't touched and seen, and just whether you can show up in those right moments, acting the correct way, that's celebrated. And it's almost like you put those things into motion about where the child is getting love, and then it just plays out into this really big way. And so one thing that's come up a lot is this idea that what a codependent person might be getting from a narcissistic person is actually this feeling that they're seen and reflected honestly. And it's interesting, you know, you can get these situations where someone is actually giving a codependent process person incredibly harsh feedback, right? And really searing criticism about their behavior. And yet, to the codependent process person, it feels like being seen and known, right? And it's almost like being so harshly criticized or held to such high standards almost validates that the love that they're getting is more real, right? That having the good with the bad makes the love feel more genuine and honest, like they earned it. as opposed to just like, yeah, I love you, you're amazing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think it's also saying that low self-esteem and a lot of self-criticism is part of personality and codependent.
Yes.
So this would go in with their,
Yes.
their definition of themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. You know, I had another client who told me, they shared with me something their partner had said, and I was like, oh, that's very harsh. And they said, nothing could be harsh compared to what I say to myself. You know? And it's again that thing where it's like almost in the other person saying it, it's relieving. Right? If you're walking around with this belief that you're, excuse my language, like a piece of shit or something, and someone says it to you, it's relieving to have it be made manifest, to have it become from the outside. It's relieving because it takes it away from you. And then you could even fight it. You could even say, no, that's not true, right? And so this is where this triangle is used in order for a victim to actually feel their sense of power. No, that's not true, I am worthy. You know, so there's like value in engaging in these processes, in giving your critical voice to a person on the outside and then being able to address it from a different part of your being. And also the other thing is, if a codependent person has been entrained to be super nice and super caring and to like be very appeasing and pleasing to others, they don't have that same freedom of expression, right? They don't have necessarily the ability to like let it rip, to go on emotional ups and downs, to roll into someone, you know? And so there can be something very, very exciting about being able to go on these emotional ups and downs of another person, where one, you still get to be the good one, right? Because you're just kind of like dealing with the fallout. And you get to avoid the vulnerability of what it would actually mean to be in touch with your own feelings. You know, there's no risk involved. And so there's something very, very pleasing about that. I also had to add this just because, you know, I was in a codependent relationship with a lot of times people would be like, oh, that guy is so narcissistic. And it always confused me because I thought it was all about me, you know? Like everyone's like, oh, all he talks about is himself. And I was like, no, the amount of attention that he gave to me made it feel like it was about me. I was like, our whole relationship is about me, you know? And it's that same thing where while I was the good child, while he was the enmeshed parent, when it was like the things that he was pumping up in me and believing it in me went along with his self-image and his idea of what he wanted the relationship to be, he was more than willing to make it all about me, right? And as soon as I started challenging things and asking for certain accountability in the relationship, then I became the bad child, he became the bad parent. I tried to individuate, I challenged the enmeshment, and that's when all the narcissistic rage came out. But there can be this moment where it truly feels like if a person is being narcissistic and you represent an aspect of them, then by logic, if they're awesome, you should be awesome too. And they can put a lot of love and time and attention, you see this with family systems a lot, into you being awesome also, right? But it's their version of the awesome you. It's a little bit of the mind fuck there. What time is it? I could talk about this stuff forever. I think it's very, very fascinating.
6:19.
Okay, 6:19. Nice. So, all right, I want to just get into this like process work approach to high and low dreams, process-oriented psychology, because they were looking at this theory and they were saying, I don't exactly think that it totally makes sense that you would be addicted to a person, right? So they created something about that which just like wasn't elegant in terms of the solution to them. So they came up with this idea of high and low dreams. So high and low dreams I feel are very intuitive, right? You have your high dreams, which are like your greatest hopes for how it could be. And then you have your low dreams, which is like your worst fears for how it could be. And high and low dreams, I think we have high and low dreams about everything, right? I could have a high dream about how I want this presentation to go, and a low dream for how I'm afraid of how it'll go. Yeah? You can have a high dream for what your new job's gonna be like, for what your new place is gonna be like, for the kind of kid you're gonna have, whatever it is. And then the low dream, the deepest fear. They sort of work together. But the idea is that in relationships, there is something almost distinct about the romantic possibility as it is presented in a modern Western context. Because I think because it has to do with love, and because it has to do with sex, and because it has to do with kind of the family that you're going to create yourself, and the life that you're going to create yourself, there's something about those dreams that we have about romantic relationships that are allowed to be a little bit more fantastical, you know, where we actually let ourselves fantasize and dream and believe that more is possible in that area of our life than we do about what job we're going to get, potentially, for some people. And I also feel like a lot of times in romance and sex and love is where secular people look for God. It's like where they look for their transcendental possibility to occur. Not everyone, some people. And so you see there, more than other places, where these high dreams, it's sort of like if you think of all of your unmet needs in childhood, right? All of the places where you weren't met, you weren't seen, you felt like it could be better. Some part of you then, in the psyche of your imagination, created this high dream about, oh, one day you'll meet this kind of person and you'll have this kind of connection, and being an adult will be like this, and like this is how it will be with them. I'm going up and up because it's getting higher and higher. But you know, and people are gonna do this to different extents. Like I said, I was a love addict, so one of the main places where I was like, but that will be glorious, was in the realm of romance. And it came from this place of like my child imagination, imagining like the answer to the circumstances that I was given. And then of course the low dream is sort of like those fears and those traumatized states kind of coalesce and make this absolute like hell picture of how it might be. And there's kind of this belief of like, if this doesn't happen, then this will happen. And if this happens, then that'll never happen, right? And so high and low dreams are semi-unconscious hypnotic states, yeah? So a lot of times we are not aware of the high and low dreams that we have. And yet they're very, very much at play. And one of the ways in which they are at play is like normally we'll see signals. And I guess this is what they said codependency was in terms of process work, is they said in codependency, the person is seeing and emphasizing signals of the high dream and ignoring or de-emphasizing signals that indicate the low dream. And this is part of that semi-conscious hypnotic state, right? Like the person will see the flowers and they'll say, oh, the high dream is happening now. And they'll avoid like the verbal abuse that happened and marginalize it. Like you can think, right, for example, if someone's high dream is like, oh, I wasn't listened to, and so I create a high dream about being like really listened to by my partner, yeah? Then I will, if I'm in a high dream state, I will see the signals of them listening and emphasize those in my map of what's happening and de-emphasize all the times when they are not listening. And vice versa, right? Like if you're in a low dream state is just as hypnotic as a high dream state. And so you will see the signals of the person not listening and see you never listen, right? They never listened, they never have listened to me. All of those kind of low dream hypnotic talks, right? And you won't look at the place where they actually might be listening to you. And yeah, I think the difference in terms of the high dreams of codependence will include more of both people, like we'll do this amazing thing together, right? Whereas like narcissism's a lot more self-centered. Obviously, it's like I'm gonna be this, you know, and you're gonna be the person on my arm, kind of thing. But gosh, I mean, it's really useful to think, like, if you think of a relationship that you were in, or maybe the relationship you're in now, it's like, what dream are you trying to make happen? What dream are you trying to make happen? What dream are you afraid of happening? And then normally we create a lot of strategies and a lot of belief systems in terms of who we think we need to be and how we think we need to act in order to get our high dream and not our low dream. There's a lot more about that, but I think ultimately these high dreams, they're like tableaus of the psyche before us, and of course they have elements that'll show up in consensus reality in the world that we can name and quantify, but I think more than anything, they are these almost like deep psychospiritual states of being. They are these energies that we're trying to bring out. And in a certain way, they're almost like energies that we're learning how to become. Right? Like, this struck home for me because I noticed that in all these relationships that I'd had, the person changed, but my dream was the same. Right? It's actually much easier to get over a person than it is to really let go of your dream. And maybe we're not supposed to let go of our dream, right? Like, my dream is something about like this like deep, like emergent union of understanding and attention. And I feel like that's also something of what I'm learning to become in my life, what I'm learning to do in my practice, the way that I'm learning to approach myself and life itself, right? It's like our dreams actually have information about the medicine that we carry, about the evolution of consciousness that we're geared towards. So there's a lot that can be gained in terms of making it conscious and then taking that power back from it needing to come from this other person and believing that you are in like a life journey of building that inside. Does that make sense? That high dream, low dream thing? Yeah. So this is like the next phase, next chapter of what we're going to be talking about. Now that we've laid out a little bit about what narcissism and codependency are, I guess the last thing is just there's a lot of literature about how they work together and the ways in which these dynamics play off each other, which I think we touched on a little bit, but if you're curious about more, I can give you more resources for that. But what I became very interested in is, other than the president, why has this become so popular? Right? Why have these terms, narcissist, codependent, empath is another one that's sometimes used when we're training individually for codependent. Why have they become so popular and so used? And what is the underlying principle, right? Because if we just like swim in the waters of what is this and what is that, it's like, what is the underlying principle? And how fascinating that they come from similar life circumstances. And that must mean something about what's happening right now in society, in the world, in consciousness. So I got very interested in that, and I created a theory. I'll now present that to you. All right, so just to put it a little bit in context in terms of time, right? Like before, in terms of civilization, people's life paths were very set, right? They were very set, depending on where you were born and what you were born, your demographics, your socioeconomic position, right? It's pretty much what your life was going to look like day to day was known. Yeah? And as modernization ramped up, that became less and less known. People started leaving their villages. There started being more upward social mobility. It wasn't necessarily determined for you who it was that you were going to marry. Things like birth control came into being, right? More and more and more possibility started opening up in terms of what an individual could be in their life. I mean, this is really relatively new. If anyone's like, in any of my other talks, I talk about this all the time because I think in a big way what we're still grappling with is this huge task that is given to each individual to determine who they are and what their life is going to look like. Yes?
I just want to tell you it's 6:30.
Thank you. Cool. Yes, these two questions, right? Who am I? What am I doing with my life? It's like now, the process of maturation, the process of survival itself depends on each individual's ability to ask themselves and to efficiently answer these two questions. And the thing is, these are two very, very different questions, right? Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? I mean, this is the question of philosophy, right? This is a question of a lot of spirituality. It's like, who am I is a deep, deep question, yeah, that involves like incredible dedication and devotion to that, whatever that unfolding mystery is, right? And what am I doing with my life is like, what am I gonna do in a social sense, right? Who am I when I introduce myself at cocktail parties? Like, how am I gonna like, all those sort of like questions that are just more about creating your social identity, you know what I mean? like two very, very different questions. And you hear people conflate them all the time. Who am I and what am I doing with my life? As if one is supposed to lead to the other. And I feel like that's the fundamental presumption that we carry within, you know, semi-privileged states of late capitalism. It's like that somehow understanding who you are is going to translate into what you're going to be doing with your life. And so I feel that something sort of happens when faced with these two questions, is that who am I in like a philosophical, spiritual, contemplative, devotional sense gets sublimated for the very pressing reality of what am I going to do with my life. And the sort of more superficial sense of who am I becomes primary, right? Who am I becomes conflated with what am I doing with my life. Who am I becomes who I am in the social world. Who am I becomes what I can present and accurately communicate about myself in English in like a 2-minute span of time. And Martin Buber was this German philosopher from a long time ago who I like still absolutely love. He created these two categories of what I means. He sort of showed the split linguistically in the word I in his book I Am Now, which is very good. And he said there's one I it, which corresponds to that social reality. So I the it, right? I the it am a woman, am a therapist, am like standing up here right now talking probably too long about things. Versus I thou is this ever unfolding mystery of consciousness that is inherently relational, right? And doesn't have discrete bounds and is like underneath language somehow. And this becomes important to me in terms of understanding narcissism and codependency, because, right, because here's what I think happens in both narcissism and codependency. I think we live in a modern time in which it rules the day, right? And you have like a self-objectification process that occurs. And you're viewing yourself as an object. And as an object whose value and worth and power and safety and love and belonging and all of that is determined relationally by how others are receiving you in their world of objects. And that this, right, objectifies the individual, has them see themselves as an object among objects. And when you're looking at things that way, it brings out this fundamental insecurity. Because if you are an object, and if everything in your life is an object, if the status you have at any given moment, if the love you have from people in your life at any given moment could leave, which it can, right? Like people who you love will die. Like someone who loves you today will not love you tomorrow. Like the people who think that you're beautiful today won't think so in 50 years, right? Like everything in our life is so excruciatingly tentative and fragile that if what you are in touch with is the level of an object among objects in reality, it made sense to me that one of the ways in which you would try to assure the love and acceptance of others is by engaging in almost these like constellations of strategies to maintain and ensure the reception of love, one of which goes in one direction we call narcissism, the other one goes in the other direction that we call codependency. But what they have in common is this self-objectification and this other objectification. So in codependency, for example, it's like this constant attempt to like be the lovable object. And it's again that other orientation, you could call it, which is this ability to like morph and change in order to be the most lovable object possible, right? Oh, you're angry at me? Let me make you cookies. Like, oh, you like it when I dress a certain way? I'll dress a certain way. You know, it's like, what can I do to be the lovable object in order to get love from the object of the other person? And then you can go the other way. In narcissism, it's more of this like self-objectified version about like, how can I use myself as an object in order, like we were saying, kind of like to dominate or to get what I want from the others, you know? And that's when it's like, I might tell you how much you're hurting me. I might like tell you how great I am. I might whatever. I might glorify my object in any million different ways in order to get that love from you. And you can call it other things, but I think it comes down a little bit to love. And so I think in my vision, these are like two strategies of self-objectification and of the sort of like almost desperate attempts to control the circumstances and to receive love in the face of this fundamental insecurity. Yeah.
So I'm curious about self and other as objectification versus Martin Buber, I and thou.
Yeah.
Do you see Martin Buber as when the I and thou as being not objectification but relational? And I guess that's what I guess to me there must be a distinction between Martin Buber's I and thou.
Yeah.
And I think of self and other in terms of I'm searching for the other to make you feel good. You're still objectifying the other until you
Yes.
feel that Martin Buber sees it differently.
Right. I think Martin Buber says where I is it. So where I is object, right? That's when you start getting into like how can I use my object? So I would say that what happens with narcissism and codependency is you're in a state of consciousness where the sense of I thou has been lost, right? It's been lost for the narcissistic person in terms of their self-identity, self-conception, self-worth is based on entirely on their I it, right? Their object and how much power and glorification and status, degrees, awards, whatever, likes that object has received from the outside. And then in codependency, it's I it in terms of not having that internal sense of I thou. And so that I it becomes relative to how they exist relational to others in a different way. But it's still how they can be the lovable object in the eyes of another.
So how do you get more to the I thou state?
Yeah. Let's see. You said it was what time?
Oh, 6:38.
Right, 6:38. Let's see. I sort of saved that for the end. But yeah. Do you mind holding off just for a little bit?
Oh, totally.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess this idea of the objectification of self within consciousness, to me, is where we get into deep philosophical significance, right? And now a lot of these things are sort of, whatever it was called, like shunned to the realm of psychology. And psychology has its own sort of like pop world that I think is very unfortunate, and then also is sort of like it's whatever you call it, inferiority complex around trying to be a hard science, and so relies a lot on trying to collect hard data. And I think it's gotten a little bit far away from its philosophical roots, right? But actually these fundamental questions of ontology, epistemology, empiricism, like these original questions about like what is a self, who am I, started off in the realm of philosophy. And so to kind of like identify this fundamental self-other worlds as objects, I think is absolutely a philosophical question, and one that if we don't address philosophically will continue on, right? Like I think a lot of the things that I've seen about approaching narcissism and codependency address the behavior. They do not address the fundamental philosophical presuppositions that are being made in order to perpetuate that type of self-idea that would then perpetuate and express those types of behaviors.
Doing research with young children to see when they actually develop a sense of self and other. I mean, that can be some pretty hardcore research.
Totally, yes.
So I think, and so that sometimes this constant need to have positive input in order to maintain self-esteem.
Yes.
Which I find is interesting. But I don't know how far anybody has taken that, because I've never read anything beyond that article that I'm not really feel so well.
Right. But I think that's absolutely true. And the same for codependence. And it's that like that lack of sense of self that requires the validation of others. But I think the validation that's coming from others is more for its object, right? Because there's actually a tremendous fear of getting too close to what might be more vulnerable, what might be that more I thou. And so it's that push-pull of like this intense need and desire to have the deep self be touched, and then this terror and a bunch of defense protest strategies that come out if it's attempted. But yeah, and so actually getting validation for your like social object or your objectified self is like a hole with a bucket in it, right? Like it can never fully be filled because it's not touching the deep thing. I think that intimacy is more of a result of not having developed that I-thou sense, that sense of self that is not objectified, that is not existing in a world of objects, of gaining or receiving love. I think it's more of a lack of ability to connect to a sense of self beyond objectification. And that, yeah. And especially, you know, in this age, it's like one study or theory that I do know of that I really like in terms of when does the self begin this process of objectification goes to Lacan's idea of the mirror phase, right? Where the child experiences themselves as a certain kind of like free-flowing, like wave or ocean of experiences and emotions, and then at some point like is able to recognize themselves in the mirror. And what they see in the mirror appears to be like a somewhat static image, right? And yet they themselves experience themselves as sort of chaotic. And so they'll sort of sublimate everything that doesn't go along with that image in order to correspond to it. And that's that process of beginning to identify as it, beginning to identify as the thing in the mirror instead of the baby in the room. And I think maybe what we need of is more baby in the room. And especially this mirror phase is just like taken out to infinity with media, right? Like not only do we have mirrors, we have cameras, we have social media, we have video, we have like, it's so, you know, it's like baby's first selfie, right? It's like we're being born, we're constantly being in this feedback loop with representations of our social being. And so it can be very easy to start to stay up there and work on harnessing and honing and identifying and perfecting how you show up at that level of media representation and not develop that deeper sense inside of I-thou. And I think when we have this channels of relational libidinal release, yeah. And what I do is I think this creates like the fundamental phenomenological category of how we understand ourselves and other in the world, and super, super limits it down in terms of what we believe is even possible, what we believe is even consciousness, what we believe another person is, and that this lays the ground for things like prejudice, nationalism, violence, abuse. If things are just objects in your world, where your object and your ability to be and exist and get the things that you need is a primary importance, then you're way more likely to be involved with things like prejudice, nationalism, violence, abuse, right? Because the actual consequences of are much less, right? If you're an object separate from other objects. And just to say, since I'm up here with you guys, I also think that like one of the main phenomenological categories we have is just that we're human beings, you know? As opposed to whatever, flows of information, flows of attention, awareness, consciousness, sense perception. Like even sometimes I think when I've been in my own meditations trying to take this really far, Even the fact that we assume that another thing is a person, right? Like that's an ontological, that's an epistemological, just throw some philosophy words out there. That's like a deep category that we've created. What is a person, right? What if we made a person mean? How do we shortcut in our mind to say what that person is? And how much does our idea of person and the like meaning that we put on that actually reflect how we experience ourselves or actually reflect that person, right? And how does that limit what we believe is really happening in life? This is just getting into like some of where this objectification, self-objectification has shown up in the literature. Freud had a lot of interesting ideas. First of all, narcissism was first created in like 1989, I believe, by this guy named like Ellis Hertz. Oh, I'm gonna forget it. Hertz someone, but it was like someone who narcissistic-like personality was someone who sort of like compulsively masturbated, right? That's where it came from, narcissistic life. So of course, Freud loved that, and he was saying that there's sort of like. Oh, here it goes. A person suffering from a neurosis may attempt to regain narcissistic satisfaction by directing his or her love towards someone who represents the fulfillment of the neurotic's own ideal ego. Freud called this the cure by love, and reports that some patients leave analysis when they find a suitable ideal love object and continue their therapy relationship with that person. I think I wanted to put this into play just because, you know, in terms of my own recovery around love addiction, I kind of had to confront how often I objectified the different players in the scene, right? How often it was that I had objectified the lover that I was with. How often I felt that now objectified, they should be giving me certain things or acting a certain way or making me feel a certain way. It's like so easy to fall into these traps of beginning to see ourselves and others like objects, right? Or it's like, oh, I said I'd do this and I didn't do that. I feel bad. I failed. All of that is seeing oneself as an object in a certain way that was supposed to perform a certain function and didn't. There's this tremendous lack of compassion and spontaneity that happens when you start assuming these known quantities about things. And in terms of Freud's idea of the ego, it's basically made up of three parts, right? There's yourself, who you think that is. There's the other, who you think they are. And then there's this sort of like God the Father kind of judge around, right? Who's like, if you think about someone who feels guilt or feels shame about someone, they feel guilt or shame relative to what? To this third part of the ego that's like something watching them inside, deciding whether they did good or bad or should feel guilty or ashamed. And so that actually reclaiming that part is a big part of what Freud said, like believing that you are your own judge, you are your own ability to see and witness yourself is a big part of healing this split and actually allowed neurosis to go down. And then Hegel also was super into this idea of alienation and how that fed into a lot of the things that we saw. And what he did, I think his version of if the self is to make itself an object of consciousness, it can only do so, i.e. become known to itself in what it really is through its own activity, its self-realization. And the progress of critical reflection upon the adequacy of knowledge to its objects becomes a progress in the history of Geist. And Hegel had this idea that there's a sort of deeper spirit, what I would say is his thou, that there's a Geist that's moving us, and getting in touch with that is kind of what is able to lead us through these dark times of self-objectification and alienation. And then, do you guys know the myth of Narcissus itself? Yeah, totally. Do you know the myth of Echo and Narcissus? First of all, I just think it's beautiful that the Greeks had a myth for Echo, Like it makes you
Yeah.
think if you go into that like ancient mind, like yeah, what the hell is an echo? Like that's the kind of thing that you might want to explain with a nymph. So Echo is this like convivial nymph, right? And she loved woods and the streams and everything. She was very chatty. She chatted all the time, and she chatted with Zeus or Jupiter, and then of course won the fancy of Zeus and Jupiter, who is very easy to win the fancy of, right? And Juno, or Hera, depending on whether you're doing Greek or Roman, punished her. It was like, you who is so chatty. Like, the curse that she gave Echo was that she couldn't be the one to initiate speech, that she could only repeat back what was said to her. And so she was stripped of her ability to win through her charm, and deprived of her ability to sort of like show how great she was, right? And you can think about this, Echo is the one that's sort of used in terms of like codependence or empaths, like that there's something about that your ability to sort of like join in yourself, to present yourself, to like share what's going on with you, for you, to use your voice. Very Little Mermaid, actually. It also like gives me like patriarchal chills. But that is taken away from you, right? And so all she can do is repeat back other people. And Echo is, gallivanting around the hills and woods, and she sees Narcissus, who's like this very beautiful young man, and becomes very attracted to him. And so he's hunting stag, and she's hunting him, right? And sometimes he hears the pitter-patter of feet, and he goes, "Who's there?" And she goes, there. He says, "Show yourself." She goes, "Yourself. And finally turns around and he's like, "Are you here?" And she goes, "Here. And she runs and she goes to like give him this big old hug. And he says, "Who are you?" And like pushes her aside and says, "Absolutely not." And then she like is just completely heartbroken and grief struck and like wanders around and around until all that's left of her body completely decays, and all that's left of her is this echoing voice in the hills. I know, it's so sad, right? But it's interesting if we look at her, the deeper thing is like, number one, that she's attracted to the one who will reject her, right? I want to look at them just a little bit, because I think they're almost like seeds for where these dynamics starts. Like, she is attracted to someone who will reject her, like someone who is not available. And yet, it's that codependent thing, right? Where it's like he's chasing the stag, she's chasing him, repeating his own words in order to get his attention. Not only that, but in terms of presenting herself, he doesn't even know that she's there, right? It's like, he's like, "Who's there?" And she's like, here. Like, there's something about sort of like that throwing herself at him when he's not available that I think is very common, right? At a moment when it's not well timed. He's not like there looking into her eyes, saying anything, right? It's like he's hunting and caught off guard. And then this idea that she like disappears bodily until only her voice remains. Yes, totally.
What I sometimes think about, and you had made a comment to it, was the Hollywood production where he goes after her or she goes after him and they're not available. And the story then revolves around how they try to connect with each other.
Absolutely. And I'm like a big, I really like poetry, like sort of erotic tragedy, poetry and rock music and like all that stuff. Like every cultural influence I've had in my life has been setting me up to love like this, every single one. And like to idealize and romanticize the drama and the pain and the suffering and the cycles of makeup and breakup, every single one. Absolutely. And that's sort of like mundane, sort of deep self-awareness, self-reflection, signal-based trust is like not as glamorous.
Well, in the same time, you know, the Hollywood thing is, you know, they'll live happily happily after.
Or Romeo and Juliet style, they'll both just kill themselves.
But in reality, you know, it could be very ambivalent, but very not sure. But that isn't the way the Hollywood story, and I use Hollywood as an example, but
Yeah.
you know, I just think it's kind of interesting how popular culture pushes this on us a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just does.
Yeah. I fully agree. I fully agree.
It's just about 7.
Oh, great.
You know.
Okay, yeah, totally. And I think part of like wanting to believe in that is part of where you'll like dive in, right? Instead of being like, oh, what signals am I getting? What signals am I getting? High dream, low dream, what signals am I getting beyond that about this actual person, right? It's like you see them in the field and you're there. Narcissists. Okay, we're coming to the end and then I'd love to just open it up more. So Narcissism himself, he could not accept the love of Echo, if you think about it. And actually there are a bunch of stories of narcissists who shunned those who loved him. Like he was loved by a man and he like sent the man a sword, you know, and the man actually killed himself with the sword to prove his love. Like this was not a guy who was like, you know, like desperately wanted love and was very vain. And yet when it came to someone actually loving him, shunned it and couldn't receive it. And that I think that this reflects sort of like an inability to truly receive love in the self-objectified state. Like exactly what you were saying. Like someone doesn't want to get too close. I think actually probably expressed in both of these sort of constellations or processes is that fear of true vulnerability, of what happened if you really were met and really were loved. You'd have to go into something completely different, right? And so Narcissus is actually, because he's so self-objectified and concerned with his image and how people see him can't receive love. And you can say on the other side, like Echo is throwing herself at someone who's unavailable, which is also avoiding that depth of vulnerability.
I'm thinking of a saying of Groucho Marx's, I never joined a club that would get me as a member.
Right, totally, absolutely, absolutely. And distortion of it reflects fundamental insecurity. Yes, so also Hera, or Juno, doesn't just curse him on her own, she goes to Nemesis, who's kind of this old crone sort of figure in Greek mythology who I love. And what Nemesis does to curse him, it says, you can only love what can never be fulfilled, right? And we all know what happens next to Narcissus after he rejects Echo, is he is going in this high, sort of silver-watered lake up in the forest to drink because he's thirsty from the hunt, and he sees his own image, and he believes it to be an other. He believes it's someone else. I think that gets misrepresented in the myth. People think he falls in love with his own image, but he only falls in love with it because he believes it's someone else. And he says, don't leave me, you know, the same way Echo did. And he like cries into the pool and it disturbs the ripples of the water. And he says, where did you go? And then of course the water stills and he comes back and he goes, oh, thank God, there you are. Like, why do you taunt me so? You know? And so it's this idea to love only what can be unfulfilled. And I think that's that same pattern where it's like your real sort of like your grandiose self-image, because of its fundamental insecurity, can never be on stable ground, can never be fulfilled. And it's creating this love for that other that we see in the mirror that is never going to be good enough if we only see it at the level of its reflection. And in terms of just like the implications of believing his reflection as an other, I've meditated a long time about this. And I've come up with all sorts of things. One is I think we believe we see others when what we see is our self-reflected, right? Like I had the same high dream, partner after partner after partner, right? I thought I was seeing them. I thought I was seeing the potential of our connection. I was seeing myself. I was seeing my own dream in them over and over and over again, potentially. So we think we see others. We see ourselves reflected. The same, it's like someone is giving you really harsh criticism. You think they're seeing you, right? But they're like almost part of your own projected self-awareness. You think it's an other. It's you. It's those same beliefs and feelings you have about yourself. The other is that the objects of desire cannot be attained. I think there's just something about that. And you were there at the other talk I did about community and other positive disillusionments. I think we assume that we're going to feel a certain way when we achieve a certain status or when we gain a certain object, and then it's just like ever disillusioning again and again, that normally once you get that thing, once you get that new job, once you get whatever it is that you think you're going to get, it's normally not the way you thought it was going to be forever and ever and always, unchanging, you know? And so like what we project or believe is within those objects of desire is often unattainable, right? Cannot be fulfilled. And that, this is the last point, is just that what you see is the object on the surface of the water, not the water itself, right? We look in the mirror and we see that objective self-image. We do not see the baby in the room. We do not see the process of consciousness. We do not see the underlying paradoxical multiple chaos. We do not see the like nuances of felt experience. We do not see like the flow of attention and awareness. We see like a person. And then there's this like field of mystery happening beneath. And so something about that, it's like when we look at ourselves, right? When we look at another, do we see the person the way that Narcissus sees an image on the water? And then I think what I'd say in terms of getting beyond that self-objectification is like also being able to see the water. Being able to see the water. People, our ideas of who people are, our ideas of who we are, to me are very sort of like surface level compared to what's really going on inside of being. So this is my last point, is just I think in terms of like creating a sustainable, fundamental way of going underneath these cycles and dynamics, which are so pernicious, you know what I mean? Like so much suffering is caused by being in these states of self-objectification, of like feeling unloved, of thinking that you'll be loved if you do something and then not, you know, just like suffering. Is to address this fundamental objectification, right? And developing that internal witness, like developing something that can see you beyond what is going on. I think this also goes into being comfortable with the highs and lows of external reality and find something alternative as a foundation, right? So like not believing that you need to wait until a person comes in order to be able to give you that high dream, but finding ways to embody your high dream now, finding ways to almost like become whatever that energy is that you're looking for in your relationship, that you'll believe you'll be able to be if you have the things that you want, the success you want, whatever, and integrating that into your idea of who you are now. And honestly, get comfortable with highs and lows of external reality. Like, if you're so terrified that someone is going to leave you, then meditate on them leaving you. It's good practice. And then I think there's also something about integrating the essence of both, right? Like to be able to express and repress with awareness. Like one of the most healing things that I did, actually, and this is not in terms of like super overt, really hurtful narcissism, but to understand like I was drawn to that narcissistic personality type because I needed it. Right? I needed that self-belief. I needed something to say, like, to believe that I could do it. Like, why not me? Why not stand in front of a bunch of people and give a talk, you know? And picking that up, right? Like, that's something that I'd relied on my partner to do for me, to talk me up and be like, you can do it. You got stuff to say, whatever, you know? And so picking that up of like finding it in myself to be like, yes, I can do it. I think that's what's happening with politics right now. You know, like Trump's like, sure, I could be president. And a bunch of people are like, you know what? Me too. Like I have just as much experience as him. Why not me? And so maybe we actually, in addition to saying like there's certain parts of narcissism we should really address, maybe that's also coming so big and popular because like, hey, you know, why not a little bit more? Why not you and you and you? Like, why not everybody write a fucking book? Go for it, you know? And then, yeah. Anyway, and the same with codependency, like that essence. Like when, I spend a lot of time, of course, because it comes along with all the self-criticism and shame and blame and everything like that, but it took me a long time to come to really valuing that part of myself. Like we also need more of that, right? Like that ability to be attuned to other people, like the relational turn. We need more self-orientation. We need more other orientation to truly, come together and address this moment. And valuing that too, it's an incredible gift to be attuned to others. It's an incredible gift to want to be of service. And there's like gold in the garbage, you know what I mean? There's like something valuable to harvest there. So yes, those would be my things in terms of like what I have found helpful. And it's like both in terms of addressing this fundamental objectification, getting okay with reality as it is, things go up and down, any desire that I'm projecting onto someone will probably not come from that person. Developing an internal witness, so I'm no longer looking at that from the outside, right? And I witness more to my I, thou sort of nature. And then also integrating the essence of both. And being able to express when I'm feeling things, being able to repress and be contemplative and strategic about stuff when I feel like it's useful. And of course, connecting to your own dream, which I think is really powerful in terms of how to dream stuff. Thank you. I think it's easy, going back to your question, to recognize, yes, man in a uniform, baseball player is objectified. The theater is interesting because you're working with people who are engaging with that process more consciously. But I think in a deeper way, all of us have, I don't know about all of us, right? But many people have a self-objectified view that they believe their livelihood depends on, right? Whether it's like, oh, you're supposed to be nice, right? Or you're supposed to be, have drive, or you're supposed to whatever. Like all of us have some idea of what is our successful object that we are subscribing to, and then other things that would be like terrifying to express at the level of self-objectification. It's also very interesting on a date to pay attention to whether you spend more time talking about yourself, selling yourself, more narcissistic process, and how much time you spend like asking questions and soliciting the other person, more codependent process. I think sometimes you can tell a lot there in terms of which way you're leaning. Yeah, I think when you get closer to sort of the mid-range, it's like start eating each other is what I want to say, but probably it's more accurate to say they're like a pinwheel yin-yang kind of going around. It's like I said, like for me, when I was with someone who was like actually like labeled narcissistic, I felt like it was all about me. I was like getting away with this, being in this narcissistic relationship. And then you can see a lot of times that narcissism rests fully and entirely along the other person, like giving them love and affection. And so I think the closer you get to it, the more they can, in certain expressions, blend into each other. I mean, you also think about someone who's like very codependent, and let's say they're in a relationship with someone who's narcissistic that has a lot of demands and is like that person spends a huge amount of their day thinking about themselves and about whether or not they're like living up to how they want to be in that relationship, right? There is a kind of self-involvement, I think, in the codependency. But you can just play that game, right? If there's like a point where it does, I think sometimes they like imply each other. And so they start to like, my hands are talking, but I can't. But I think you get it, right? It can like weave back and forth because they're part of the same system. Yeah.
So you feel like if you grew up in a relationship like that, you just find yourself attracted to those systems, but not necessarily to a specific role?
Yes, and actually they're roles in a field. And just like that victim abuser rescuer role, I think the narcissist and codependent role can also go back and forth, which is why I do think there might be some cases where people are like, yes, statically in one role, but often in like the dynamics of relationship, it goes back and forth. Because you can think about it, even if someone grows up in that household, right? That's the part of that system that they were, but the other is implied, you know? And so if we like go back to our conditioning, both roles were present and our early conditioning, and so both are known to us. We might feel more comfortable or spend more time in one, but somewhere inside us is the other one too. And especially in terms of, I think, just gender socialization too. I think a lot of times women get much more gender socialized into being codependent, asking lots of questions, being receptive and responsive, and men get much more socialized into being narcissistic, dominant, right? Like winning, all that kind of stuff, self-aggrandizing. You're supposed to sell yourself, you're supposed to talk about yourself. But yeah, if you grew up in a household with the other, if you've been in a relationship with the other is also known to you. And I think when you kind of like start busting out of maybe how you're socialized, it's like that other part is like waiting in the wings for you.
But would you think that the example of where they start bleeding into each other, since you like mythology and just kind of pull up a literary reference, Wuthering Heights, where Kathy would be the narcissist and Heathcliff the codependent,
Right.
but it's totally reversed. Like, we don't think of it in those terms, you know, like, because Kathy, doesn't she like burst into tears? She's really histrionic. She, you know, like, I guess, come on, when we say narcissist, everybody's thinking like a dude in a suit, you know, like we're not thinking of what a female version of that would look like, you know, so like, in that case, it looks a bit different, and it starts doing that thing, like you said, where there's that whole thing where she says, I am Heathcliff, and then his whole being is only, you know, justified when she, as a ghost, is rapping at his window, you know? It like never ends, you know? It's this miserable relationship that continues, and he doesn't see through it, you know? Like, I don't know, it just struck me.
Me too, totally. And I think these things will express according to our social conditioning, but yeah, there's absolutely other ways for that to show up. And it's such a good example.
Yeah, isn't it? I mean, I always hated that story. I don't understand why people think it's romantic. I'm like, the story is demented. It's horrible. I could barely read the book. I was so disturbed by it, you know. But I mean, speaking of great actors, Laurence Olivier, right, in the movie.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, yeah, you know, but it's disturbing.